Hello, I'm Dan Anderson, Director of Institutional Research at the Arizona Board of Regents. The Board of Regents is the governing board for Arizona's three universities: Arizona State University, Northern Arizona University, and the University of Arizona. Most of you probably know those three institutions by their major campuses in Tempe, Flagstaff, and Tucson. But in fact, the universities are in multiple locations around the state, dozens and dozens in small communities and throughout large communities in Arizona as well. What I'd like to do in this segment is talk a little bit about some quantitative information about the universities. Specifically, I'd like to talk first about the pipeline of students who are moving to the universities, our principal pipeline being the students who come to the Arizona universities through our high school systems. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the actual operations of the institutions, enrollments, degrees awarded, the financial aspects of the institutions, and then finally a little bit about the connection between the universities and the preparation of the workforce for Arizona's future, the degrees that are awarded, students working in Arizona, and their operations. First slide that I'd like to show you is a spider chart that looks at the major metrics of our universities. The board has a group of 34 metrics that we've developed for each of the universities that look at variables like number of degrees awarded, research expenditures, graduation rates, measures like that are moving the university system forward to 2020. We've in fact developed for each of the universities for each year an expectation of how many degrees might be awarded, or enrollment levels, or graduation rates, or research expenditures, or the cost per degrees awarded, so that we can track the institutions and measure them against their actual performance and see if they're on track to achieve the goals that the institutions have set for themselves and that the regents are measuring them against. To begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about the high school pipeline. That is the flow of students that move out of the K-12 system into Arizona, into the universities. Although we enroll many students from other places, non-resident students who may move to Arizona, students who have been in the community college system who transfer to our institutions, the principal source of students to the Arizona universities are high school graduates. As you can see from this particular graphic, the number of students who are growing, and right now Arizona's system is graduating about 60,000 high school students a year. The number of students, the greatest source of growth for those students is among minority students. White students are just about 30,000 on an annual basis and are expected not to change very much in the years ahead. And so one of the challenges that the universities have is if they're going to grow and expand and move Arizona's economy forward, how do we continue to enroll more students as that growing population, particularly among Hispanics, but also among other minority groups, continues to grow in the years ahead. But not only is it important to consider the fact that it's a growing population, but how well prepared are those students to move on to the universities? And that's what the next slide looks at. The next slide is what we call a view of eligibility. How well prepared are students who are graduating from high school to move on to the universities? To be eligible for admission, students have to take at least 14 of 16 core courses. Core courses would be things like math and English. There's a requirement of 4 years of math and 4 years of English and a combination of other classes. If a student has taken at least 14 of those 16 core courses, they're potentially eligible for admission to the universities. And as you can see from this graphic, particularly among minority groups, their preparation for admission to the universities is low, around a little over 30%, 30 to 35%, depending on if you're looking at Hispanics or Native Americans or blacks. While among Asians, it's over 60% who are prepared, almost 70% prepared for eligibility for admission, and over 50% for whites. So one of the real challenges the universities have in working with the K-12 system is getting students better prepared for admission to the universities into the future. The next slide takes a look at the outcomes of students. What is actually happening to Arizona high school graduates who move on to post-secondary education, whether it be with one of the three public universities into Arizona's community college system or possibly moving out of state to other higher education. You can see just a little bit less than 50% of recent Arizona high school graduates have not had any contact whatsoever with post-secondary education. And though that may change over the next year or two as people may have gone on to military or other activities and then return to post-secondary education, if the experiences of earlier high school graduating classes in fact repeat, over 40% of Arizona high school graduates are not going on to any post-secondary education, and those who do go on to post-secondary education, only about 22% of all Arizona high school graduates are receiving a 4-year degree. If Arizona is going to achieve the kind of high education, high value added economy that we're looking forward to, we need to move that number to much higher levels. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the enrollment and operations of the universities. The 3 universities in total have enrollments of over 140,000 students with annual operating budgets of over $4 billion. They're very large organizations spread across many different locations. As you can see from the first graphic here, we have looks at the racial and ethnic distribution of our undergraduate enrollments. Over 60% of our undergraduate students are whites, and a little bit over a third of our students are minority students. As I mentioned earlier, because of the rapid growth in the minority population, particularly here in Arizona, but nationally as well, one of the challenges that we face, as do all educational institutions, is trying to get greater participation of those groups of individuals into the higher education system and on to degrees. It's not just a matter of enrolling students, it's also a matter of being able to retain those students, to be able to move them through the system and on to degrees and then employment in the workforce. The next slide takes a look at degrees awarded. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just a matter of enrolling students, it's also a matter of creating degrees for those students. The Board of Regents, in conjunction with the universities, has a goal that by 2020, almost 31,000 undergraduate degrees will be awarded on an annual basis. That's a substantial increase from where we were before, and is a rate of increase that virtually no other state in the nation has been able to achieve. And so far, I'm happy to say that we're on track to achieve that goal. The majority of our growth is going to be in the undergraduate programs, as is the need of our economy, but also, as you can see from this graphic, there's growth in the graduate areas. These would be master's degree programs, these would be PhD programs, these are first professional degrees that would be areas like medicine and law. There's a wide variety of needs within the economy for people with post-secondary education, and the universities are advancing that. As you can see in the next graphic, where we take a look at bachelor's degrees awarded by race ethnicity, even a larger percentage of those who are receiving their undergraduate degrees are in the white population. And again, this is one of the challenges that we have, is a matter not only of getting minority students prepared and moving on to the institutions and into the institutions, but then getting them on to graduation. There are many challenges that those individuals face. Some of them are financial, some of them are family related. Many of them don't have any previous connection with post-secondary education. Their parents didn't have that education, they don't have that experience, and so there's a number of issues in retention and continuation in higher education that are issues that we're addressing and trying to move forward with. Not only is it important to take a look at the enrollment of students, but I think it's also important to understand the financial operations of these organizations. As I mentioned earlier, very large, over $4 billion in total operating expenses. They're involved in many different areas, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking not only about the expenses of those organizations, but also the revenues and where those revenues come from. First slide here takes a look at funding formulas. Education in general, in most public higher education institutions, is a combination of 2 factors. It's public resources and it's private tuition and fees. On the tuition and fees area, I think it's been well documented over the last few years that all institutions have had to see an increase in tuition and fees for a variety of reasons. Most of it is because of the Great Recession that we've just worked through, where state revenues were really under severe pressure, and legislatures and other organizations simply didn't have the resources to be able to fund higher education. It had been the case for many years here in Arizona that we use a funding formula for funding the universities called 22-to-1. And simplistically put, that means that for every 22 additional students that an institution would enroll, the legislature would fund the institution's 1 additional faculty position plus a part of a support position, and that's where the 22-to-1 idea comes from. The difficulty that many people had with that is that it really provided the institutions with an incentive to increase enrollments, and there was the feeling there wasn't necessarily the incentive to graduate students. That this was an input-oriented formula. Enroll as many students as you can, the state will pay for those students on a 22-to-1 basis, and there was interest in pursuing other alternatives. So over the last 2 years, we've moved on to what's called a performance-based system. And the performance-based system is more of an output-oriented system. Instead of looking at how many students are you enrolling, it looks at measures like the number of degrees that are being awarded. What specialties are those degrees being awarded in? Are they in graduate programs or undergraduate programs? Are they in high-need areas for the state like STEM? And there's an appropriate funding system that rewards those increases in high-value positions. As well, the funding formula takes a look at student credit hours. It's just not a matter of students who are enrolling, but rather making sure that those students take appropriate class loads to get them on to graduation. And then finally, research funding. The universities are very strong entities in the whole research area. They bring in millions and millions of dollars on an annual basis from corporations, from the federal government, and from other entities. And so the funding formula looks at those three pieces: degrees awarded, credit hours, and research funding to determine additional dollars from the state to the universities. The next slide takes a look at the revenues of the universities. What are those revenues? And let me just kind of go over those very briefly here. As you can see, last fiscal year, the universities had total revenues of about $3.9 billion. That's made up, of course, of not only the educational aspect of the institution, but also a number of the non-educational aspects. That might be ticket sales from football games or concerts. It might be room and board activities. It might be research functions. There are a number of other ancillary activities that the universities are involved in that contribute to the overall revenues. A little over half of those revenues, 56%, $2.2 billion, are dedicated specifically to the educational enterprise. And of course, that would be things like utilities for classrooms, faculty salaries, those kinds of direct educational expenses, student support services, and things like that. But that still leaves over $1.7 billion overall dedicated to a lot of those other additional aspects. So I'm trying to make the point here that not only are the universities large educational institutions educating both undergraduate students and graduate students, but are involved in a variety of different things. And to put that into perspective, the total state general fund budget for fiscal year 14 is about $8.8 billion. And when you compare that to what we project the budget will be for the three universities this coming fiscal year of about $4.2 billion, you can see that these are very large operations, almost half of the total general fund operation of the state. The next slide takes a little bit of a historical look at state funding for the institutions and basically looks at it from the perspective of what share of total state appropriations go to the universities. Back in 1979, almost 1 out of every $5 of state appropriations went to the universities. 19% of the state budget was made up of expenditures from the state general fund to the universities, or appropriations, I should say. Now, the most recent figure is that less than 1 out of every $10, about 8% of the state's general fund, is appropriated to the university. So even though the state has grown tremendously from 1979 to the present, at least as a share of the pie, as a percent of the total state appropriations, the universities have gone from 19% to a little over 8%. And of course, that has mandated that they raise revenues from some source, and that source has had to be tuition and fees. The next slide takes a look at that, but from a little bit different perspective. And this is from the perspective of the buying power, if you will, of the state appropriations that the universities receive from the state. And you can see a substantial decline. The buying power today of those dollars for state appropriations is less than half of what it was at the beginning of this chart. And so that's, again, kind of an indication of, although higher education has an aspect to it that's a public good and an aspect to it that's a private good, the private good is funded by tuition and fees, the public side is funded by the state legislature. You can see that the public side has clearly declined in the last few years. But while we talk about tuition and fees and the increase in tuition, I think there's a really important distinction to be understood between what I would call the sticker price of tuition and what students actually pay. And the next graphic, the bar chart, takes a look at exactly that. The board, on an annual basis, usually in about April, sets tuition for the three universities after consultations and many public hearings. And as you can see from this particular graphic, The sticker price, if you will look at the bar on the very far right-hand side, the sticker price is almost $10,000 in fiscal year 12. And yet the blue bars that are right next to each one of those are substantially less. Right now in this particular one in fiscal 12, about $3,600 for tuition and fees are what the average student is actually paying, even though the sticker price is nearly $10,000. How do we make up that difference? Well, the difference is made up through financial aid. There are many, many sources of financial aid available, particularly to undergraduate students, to underwrite that. Some of that financial aid is available in what we call merit aid. These might be scholarships that are labeled as the President's Scholarship or a Provost Scholarship or a Dean's Scholarship that are awarded to students based on their academic performance. Other kinds of financial aid are what we call need-based aid, maybe because you come from a low-income family. There are federal Pell Grants that are available. In general, we break grant aid, and these are dollars that don't have to be repaid. This is not looking at loans. This is not looking at work-study programs. These are dollars that are granted to the student that don't have to be repaid, that go to pay for tuition. We basically break these into a couple of different groups. One are what we call institutional aid, aid from the universities to help the cost of the student in enrolling and paying for their tuition. Then the federal government has substantial financial aid, the largest of which are Pell Grants, which are available in the area of over $5,500 on an annual basis to students who have significant financial need because of their family income. Then there's some small amounts of grants that are available from private institutions, maybe from foundations, Kiwanis clubs, other organizations like that help students with that expense as well. But in general, the average undergraduate student in Arizona is paying about 40% of what the sticker price is for tuition, and that's something that has historically been a significant factor. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the outcomes of students. It's important, of course, that we enroll those students, it's important that we graduate those students, but many students, almost probably all students, come to the universities looking to have a better life for themselves, to raise their potential for earning in the future, and to be contributing individuals in the workforce. And so what I'd like to talk about a little bit now is actually looking at the outcomes of those students who have graduated from our institutions and the contributions of them to Arizona's economy. So this first slide looks at the earnings of graduates looking back from the class of 1990 all the way to the present. We actually have data now going back over 20 years where we're able to take a look at all the students who we have and then match those up against wage records, tax records that we have in the state to see what the earnings have been of our graduates here in Arizona. And you can see that in general in the last 22 years, we have a large number of students who have graduated. Over 460,000 students have graduated from our institutions, and about half of them are currently employed in our economy, earning over $11 billion and paying almost $900 million in state and local taxes. So a large number of individuals working here and contributing to our economy. If you take a look at the next graphic, this one looks specifically at resident undergraduate students. Those are the undergraduate students most likely who graduated from an Arizona high school, who enrolled at our institutions and graduated from our institutions. And year by year takes a look at the graduating class, starting with the graduating class of 90, then the graduating class of 1991. You can see all 22 graduating classes in this particular slide and what their contribution was to Arizona's economy in 2011. A couple of pieces I want to point out to you. First, at the very bottom of this slide, you'll see that the class of 2011, almost 80%, 78.6% of the most recent graduating class of resident undergraduate students were employed here in Arizona. And of course, there are a number of other things that those students might be doing. They might have gone on to graduate school, they might have started families, they may have left the state, but clearly almost 80% of our recent undergraduates who have received a degree from one of the three universities were currently employed in Arizona earning wages and contributing. But if you look at that fourth column over and you look at some of the earlier years, you'll see year by year by year that percentage declines. So we're losing students, even though initially when a student graduates from our institutions, the vast majority of them have productive jobs in the economy. As the years progress, that number declines. And so one of the challenges I think that we have in our economy is retaining those individuals as they move on into their more productive years after they've been in the labor market for 10, 15, 20 years, and they're at their highest wage earning levels. We're down to less than 50% of our graduates who are still employed in Arizona's economy. So those people most likely have gone on to other places, wherever those other places are in the nation, to continue their employment. What can we do to capture those people, retain them, and make them a functioning part of Arizona, I think is an important piece. The last slide that I have takes a look a little bit more particularly at recent graduates from our system. This takes a look at the earnings of students who graduated in the last 5 years. There's an awful lot of talk in the popular press about how a post-secondary education is not important now, how these people don't earn anything more than people who are just high school graduates who haven't made the expense and the time commitment and the effort to their education. You can see here for the largest instructional areas in our system, the largest one being business management and marketing, then education, social sciences. You can see the different tabs on the left. You can look for each of the universities and see the number of individuals who in the last 5 years have graduated with an undergraduate degree and what their average earnings are. I'll just take a look at the very top line, for example, in the business management and marketing, the business colleges, if you will, of the universities. You can see consistently across the board, those individuals are earning $35,000 to $40,000 a year, while at the bottom of this table in the health professions and related, those individuals are earning over $50,000 a year. So those are people who have undergraduate degrees, who have only been out of school for at most 5 years, and in some cases only 1 year, and those people are earning $15 to $25 an hour in their employment. Definitely much better than a high school graduate is. So I would make the point here that across the disciplines, whether they be business or whether they be in healthcare or a number of other areas, not only are a significant number of those individuals employed here in Arizona's economy, but they're earning significant monies in their employments. So that really is the end of my presentation. I hope that gives you a basic overview of some of the significant factors in the university system and the operations of our institutions. Thank you very much.